Is this thing on? Welcome back to Movies TV Mad. Of course, you can follow me on Twitter at Movies TV Mad. And welcome to Wednesday's edition of the dceu Daily. I come from an era, I'm a 49-year-old man, and I come from an era where a movie franchise meant very different things than it does today. I grew up, for example, with the James Bond franchise. The James Bond franchise, when I was a kid growing up and the original continuity, it wasn't really kind of interconnected, apart from the fact that you had James Bond, you had Moneypenny, you had Felix Leiter, and you had Q. So it wasn't about Easter eggs and cameos, it was about self-contained Bond stories taken mostly from Ian Fleming's novels. You look at Christopher Reeve's Superman movies. Superman the movie, one of the best superhero movies, the first superhero movies ever made. You have Superman 2, really continuing from that story. Superman 3 self-contained, Superman 4 self-contained, but it's a continuation of that franchise, but it really isn't, it's not introducing other heroes or anything like that. Star Wars as well. George Lucas's original trilogy. Yes, it's a continuation. It's a story with the same characters. But again, there's no cameos. There's no Easter eggs because ultimately it's an original story. Because I grew up within a time in franchises with original stories. Again, Raiders of the Lost Ark is about someone who's going out looking for antiquities. But it's a bit of an adventure and it's fun. And, he's a wise ass, as Harrison Ford kind of played a character already in Star Wars who was a wise ass. So films were about films, even in franchises back then. Back to the Future is the same thing. It didn't become a parody of what it was. So films today and people who write films today kind of are inspired by films they grew up with. It's why Avengers Endgame has got so much callback to Back to the Future 2. Now, people have always been inspired by other movies, but they're heavily referenced in today's live-action media. And so, a franchise today is very different. The Marvel Cinematic Universe changed the meaning of what a franchise is. The interconnectivity, even from Iron Man 2, its second movie. We have the introduction of Nick Fury, Black Widow, Natasha Romanoff. They begin very early on. So that was the plan from fate. This is something that we never saw before. This interconnectivity, because it's a universe based on a bunch of comic books, right? And he's bringing in all these characters. He's doing cameos. He's doing Easter eggs. He sets the precedent of what a franchise needs to be today. Not in my opinion, but the media, critics. So now the MCU has got over 20 movies and a few streaming shows as well. So they stick to the formula because that formula makes a ridiculous amount of money. Spider-Man No Way Home made over 800 million just in its own country of America. And just because it brought in iconic versions of these Spider-Man. It's not necessarily that it's the best film in the world. I will say Spider-Man No Way Home is a much better film than I thought it would be. I will give it that credit. It focuses on the most part on Tom Holland's Peter Parker. And I thought his arc was absolutely beautiful. They take liberties here and there, like Aunt May stealing Uncle Ben's, immortal words. But apart from that, it is a really good film. But you still got the facts that Spider-Man No Way Home is a hyped movie, it's a loved movie, because Tobey Maguire and Andy Garfield are playing their Spider-Man from other films, right? That's how it works. So the expectation now is to do these things, cameos and things like that. But the problem is, it's not the MCU, it's not just the MCU that are expected to do this. Because the MCU is so successful, every other franchise is expected to do this. So what happens when you've got a film like Morbius and all of a sudden you've got all these rumors about Spider-Man, Tom Holland Spider-Man, and this one and that one. And now there's rumors from people who have apparently seen it that they've cut Michael Keaton's scenes, He's only in a couple of post-credit scenes. They cut out Venom, Tom Hardy's Venom as well, because they don't know what to do. The pressure is on. So now you've got people calling it a bad movie before they've seen it because cameos are being cut. When art is kind of shrunk down to who's going to be in it from other universes and other movies, you really have a problem. And this is the problem that the Sony kind of Spider-Man kind of extended universe they're trying to do has a problem. Because right now, it's a Spider-Man franchise without Spider-Man and just like Spider-Man characters in it. That's where the problem is. So, you know, what do you do with that? And this can hurt the MCU. But of course, there's MCU shills who love nothing better than to attack the Sony Marvel universe. And we know that as well. But this is the problem that Feige's created. It's not his fault. He was doing something that worked. And it's worked, and the MCU has become a pop culture icon. I'm not happy that it has. It's damaged the fabric of entertainment and art and what people want from films today. I really believe that, because the kids are not interested in anything but the MCU. So what does that do for everyone else? So we come to the DCEU, and obviously they knew they had to do this. They knew they needed a DC extended universe. And so David Goyer had an idea for a Superman film that later became the first act of the DC extended universe. But they brought in Zack Snyder. And all of a sudden, Zack Snyder's running this thing. There's no DC president like there is at Marvel Studios. DC didn't start with a DC Studios. DC started with Man of Steel, and Zack Snyder was running the narrative. And you had Jeff Johns there. You had a few other people behind the scenes. Obviously, there were disagreements. You didn't have one leader. So you've already got a problem. There's an old saying in the UK, too many cooks spoil the broth. And certainly at the beginning of the DCEU, you had that problem. Because who's in charge? Jeff Johns? Who knows? You know, John Berg, and now we've got Walter Hamada. It's a very weird situation. So Snyder is basically all about subverting expectations when you watch a movie, about deconstruction. The very opposite to what Feige's doing over at the MCU. He's just making a bunch of fun movies. He's adapting these Marvel characters as accurately as possible. He'll take liberties here and there. There have been some calamities, like moving Ed Norton's Hulk away and bringing Mark Ruffalo's in. There's been issues. Look what he's done to Mark Ruffalo's Hulk now. It's a bit dumb and bad. But on the whole part, people are pleased with what Feige has done. But there's also another issue. The mainstream audience think they know Marvel Comics because they watch the MCU. But if you talk to Marvel diehard comic fans, they hate the MCU. So that's another kind of situation and conversation. Not all the comic book fans are really being pleased, but it's making money. So Disney don't care. Every movie they make, whether good or indifferent, makes money. But this Snyder character has come in, and he's kind of shook the narrative of what a franchise is. Because he said, I don't care about the mainstream audience. I just want to make films that subvert expectations, deconstruct characters, then we can reconstruct them again. That's his ethos. His favorite DC comics are deconstructive comics. So everyone knew who and what Zack Snyder was and what he stood for. And even though they wanted to compete with Disney and Marvel Studios, they still brought him in. Because I love Snyder's DC verse. I think his 3 movies are sensational. And if it was me, and if I was in charge, I would have allowed him to finish off, then bring someone else in. We've had that discussion many times. Driving him away in the middle of the arc is what's caused the problems now. And they're finding that out. So all of a sudden, you've got this DCEU that starts with these Snyder movies. They move him away. And then they try and go on a kind of self-contained direction. There's some good movies there. There's some indifferent movies there. I think Wonder Woman 84 is subjectively bad. I think Birds of Prey is subjectively bad. But mostly, despite the problems within the franchise, the DCEU has some really, most of the movies are really, really good. And I still say this, that they'll be talked about in 30 to 50 years more than the MCU will be. Now, people will talk about the MCU because of its success, because of the formula and all of that. But in terms of the movies individually, they won't really be celebrated. A couple of them will be, but most of them won't be, because it's just another version of the same movie. But it works. It'll be interesting when the MCU does start to die down and the hype does start to die down and people start to go off superheroes. It'll be interesting what Hollywood does then. What will be the new fad? Can they save the industry? Because by riding on the coattails of the MCU and just keep on, bankrolling superhero movie after superhero movie, doesn't have any big thinking to it, any longevity to it. But when you had blockbusters when I was growing up, mostly the action flicks like Schwarzenegger, Stallone, things like that, there were still other artistic movies being made. There was a variety. There's no variety anymore. It's the next MCU movie. What cameo is going to be in there? What character's going to be in there? It's all they fucking well talk about. And so the DCEU is kind of weird in the sense that it started off on this connective formula with Snyder. Whether you like what he did or not, there was connective tissue. It was going to be an extended universe. He had plans, but he wasn't going to stay there forever. It was just one story arc. So very different. But I believe that Snyder is more with keeping with the history of WB and what they do, more than Marvel just putting something out there. Warner Brothers in their history were always artistically driven. That's why we had Burton's Batman 89 and 92. Artistic, Superman the movie, Joker movie, the Dark Knight trilogy, all very heavily artistically made. The MCU movies are not about art, and they're not really about cinema. Not in the old-fashioned sense. They're just about coining in the money and hype. That's all they're about. So it's the DCEU's it's like a rebel. The DCEU is like this rebel who kind of goes against the narrative, goes against what the mainstream audience want. And so you have these three DC movies, then he gets driven away and they do Justice League. Justice League is anti-WB. It is, in its history. There's no way the original Warner Brothers would ever have done anything like this. And suddenly we see Justice League and we find out, for one reason or the other, that this is not Zack's movie. That he was driven out and a lot of toxic things happened. But the amazing thing about this, and the reason we won the fight to release the Snyder Cut, was because Zack was in the background releasing all these things. And you can't convince me of anything different, because how did we get to see the Iris Flash scene? The scene when Flash puts his finger through the glass, that scene was leaked just after Justice League was released. There's no way we could have seen that unless Zack had leaked it, allegedly. So Zack was desperate for us to know what had happened, and he wanted us to see his movie. So when people were saying to us, stop fighting, he just let the guy move on, the guy never wanted to move on. He still doesn't want to move on. It's a fascinating, unique situation where a movie director and the public unite together to fight for something, right? And let's not talk about the near $500,000 have been raised for AFSP, or whatever I think the suicide prevention, I forgot what it's called, but he's very, very passionate about this suicide prevention charity because of his daughter Autumn tragically taking her own life. And, I've donated, lots of people have donated, and it's near $500,000. It's amazing. So Zack and his fans, us, have got a great connection, because without us, his movie would never have been seen. And what a movie the Snyder Cut is. Again, so very different to what the first Avengers film is. This is a 4-hour epic that tells the story of And in a way, it's still an invasion story like, with Avengers 2012, but it's very differently made. And it's kind of like a real god invading Earth. Like Loki in Avengers 2012, he's kind of suave, he's funny, it's not the same as Thanos coming to invade. So it's a very different story, the Snyder Cut. But you see the film and you realise how different it is to Justice League, and you kind of scratch your head and say, why didn't they want us to see this? And the reason Warner Brothers didn't want us to see this is because the world had told them, we don't want this deconstructive of subverting expectations type of story. The mainstream audience wanted the DCEU to be the MCU. Now, Snyder's movies were making money, the first two. MOS did a solid 650. Obviously, Warner Brothers weren't happy with that. And BVS made a solid, I think, 880 or something like that. They wanted to make much more with that. That's why they wanted a Batman and Superman kind of fight movie. But Snyder had other ideas. And so the very essence of Snyder and the DCEU is the stark contrast of what a franchise is perceived to be today. So because people look at the DCEU and its disjointedness, they say the DCEU sucks. But of course, the DCEU is a very complex situation because you've got Snyder's movies, then you've got the other movies, and really the story of the Snyderverse behind the scenes and the story of the DCEU is just as compelling and interesting to me as the movies. And what's even more interesting to me now is that actually it's still continuing. The fight goes on to restore the Snyderverse. And I've noticed in the past week or so, the rumors are back. There's more excitement within that community. I'm part of that community. Something is going on. For example, when Wayne T. Carr released the image of him in the Green Lantern costume, Ryan Reynolds liked it. I think he may have even commented or quote tweeted on Wayne T. Carr's post, because apparently there was a plan to use Ryan Reynolds' Green Lantern with Wayne's John Stewart's character in the Snyder Cut. So that's interesting. So Ryan Reynolds is blatantly a supporter of Zack Snyder because he even joked when he was somewhere released the Snyder Cut. And even though he said it as a joke, he meant it. Because he's dealt with WB before. The Green Lantern thing, he was treated very, very badly. And he's worked with Jeff Johns in that film. So he knows what kind of people these are. Because he came on to play Green Lantern, very exciting, and they fucked up the movie. Because they got the wrong director ultimately. And the wrong people writing it. So I think when you look at the kind of people who wrote the Green Lantern film, and the director, who's a great director, I mean, he directed Casino Royale, but his expertise wasn't in VFX and doing a film like that. He was the wrong guy, and Ryan Reynolds knows this. So there's interesting things going on again. And that's what I'm saying to you. You can ride on the coattails of the MCU, but to me, there's no satisfaction in the MCU. Oh, I've got the movies, I watch the movies, they're okay. But when I hear some people talk about them, it's like they're talking about Gone with the Wind, and they're not. This is not a classic era in Hollywood because it's about the superhero movie. And as much as I love superhero movies, it's not really that era in film where we can all stand up and be proud of. Now, as a geek and a nerd, I can be proud. Wow, that I got Man of Steel, BVS, the Snyder Cut, the Aquaman movie by James Wan, a work of fucking art. That's next on my DCEU rewatch list. Can't wait to watch it tonight. But this is not a classic era. I mean, the Dune movie is amazing. I think this is an era of beautiful cinematography, for sure. And there's a lot of these superhero movies. I just said the Batman because when I think about that movie is art, where you can make them art and you can put them as a historical moment in the movie industry. Superman the movie is an epic movie that people still talk about today. Batman 89 is still a movie we will talk about today. The Dark Knight's still a movie we talk about today. The Batman will be a movie we'll be talking about for many years to come, and who knows what Matt's got in store for us next. So it's very, very interesting. What do DC do now? Do they suddenly go down the MCU route? Because that's what Flashpoint wants to do. It wants to reboot the franchise, wipe it clean, say everything's remembered, nothing's forgotten, but this is the direction we're going now. So they want to go down the MCU route. Now there's a rumor that apparently maybe there's a nightmare sequence, a nightmare future sequence from Zack Snyder's universe in the Flashpoint movie, so they can kind of divide the Snyderverse into its own thing. And I'd be very down for that if they were actually doing that. I don't know. Also, there's a school of thought that maybe Ray Fisher has had his apology, and maybe they're gonna do some reshoots with Ray Fisher, but nobody knows. And this is the question now, the important question. Do we make different films, different universes in DC live action? Do we have the DCEU rebooted after Flashpoint, Matt Reeves' universe, the Snyderverse in its pocket universe? Will that work? Or should we do one thing or the other? That's the thing now. Or do we just focus on, comic book or tour-driven movies like The Dark Knight, like BVS, like the Batman? What kind of direction do we go here? Because that was the point I was talking about when I gave you the comparison of franchises in the 80s growing up. Back to the Future, Star Wars, Reeves' Superman movies. They weren't really about a continuing saga. Star Wars was, of course, but it was only a trilogy. Lucas only really ever wanted to make a trilogy. But now it's about that. And the longer the MCU goes, the more money the MCU makes. They're not going to stop. So now it's about David Zaslav and Discovery. Where do they want to go with this now? I suspect that Zaslav just wants to make movies that make money. Understandably, because he's just invested a hell of a lot of money. This is why he spoke about, the Holy Trinity, the DC Trinity in Superman, Wonder Woman, and Batman. He really wants to focus on them. This, of course, would upset a lot of people who lift up the smaller DC characters like Aquaman, Shazam. So will we not see as much of that anymore? Will it be all about Superman, Wonder Woman, and Batman? For me, that would be a shame. So it's going to be interesting what Zaslav and Discovery do. But what decisions will they make? Will they continue on this WB Pictures route of having the Batman universe, maybe a Snyderverse universe, and the DCEU rebooted? Or as I say, will they go self-contained and all tour-driven? What fits the bill for Warner Brothers? I think if he wants to go back to the classic Warner Brothers, then I think they will be going to all tour-driven movies rather than a franchise that expands everything and has cameos and Easter eggs. They could have different creatives doing different franchises on different Earths. But you see, they could do that as well as kind of fix the DCEU via this Flash movie reboot. And maybe that can work. I don't know. So they could do a lot of different things, you see. And I think that would be really exciting. Because if you've got a franchise for the mainstream audience that does everything the MCU does, that's great. But then you've got Matt Reeves, the Batman, Zack Snyder's, Snyderverse, and then you bring other auteur directors in, maybe like Denis Villeneuve, bring, Tim Burton back, anything. You could do anything. There's so many things you could do with this. I think that variety is the spice of life. And I think what I've just described would be the best way possible if they can handle it. Because if you reboot the Flash properly, and of course we don't know what they're doing with the Flash, then that can work. You can have this mainstream universe. It can work. You've got Blue Beetle, you've got Batgirl. Let's see where they fit into all of this. I'm a bit still kind of weirded out by the 7-month Flash delay. Shazam now coming before Flashpoint, before it was coming afterwards. Black Adam now coming before the Flash movie. Well, it was always coming before the Flash movie anyway. Black Adam was always going to be pre-Flashpoint. But apparently those two films are still kind of, supposed to be post-Flashpoint, supposed to be set afterwards. Let's see if those rumours are true. So there's a lot of unanswered questions here. But if they can finally get their shit in order and actually have a mainstream, extended universe that works, but you can have auteurs like Matt Reeves and Zack Snyder doing their own thing, this would be the best solution all round. Now, personally, what I think the future is, when the MCU dies down, is written and directed auteur movies. A Superman trilogy, a Kingdom Come trilogy, things like this. Things that auteurs take, things that, comic books adapted by people who really like those comic books. Like Snyder loves The Dark Knight Returns, and although BVS isn't that adaptation, he takes a lot from that graphic novel and puts it in there. And it looks absolutely fantastic. I think the future will be auteur driven. And I think this is where Disney will have a problem. I think we are looking at the end of the the end of the MCU hype. They're past their peak now, because Spider-Man No Way Home made a lot of money because they threw in iconic Spider-Man. Obviously, Thor: Love and Thunder will have cameos. I don't think that film will be as successful as Doctor Strange and the Multiverse of Madness, because the multiverse is coming to the MCU. They can keep on garnishing things and hobbling on for a while. But I think if Zaslav and Discovery get their shit together and have a bit of variety, a central extended universe, the Reevesverse, the Snyderverse, other auteurs coming in, we could have something incredibly special. And if everyone gets their little, pocket universe, and we have a successful extended universe in the center of all of that, I think that everything could be all right in the end. Because despite all of the DCEU's problems, I think the DCEU has some of the best comic book movies ever made. Despite all the issues, Man of Steel, one of the best comic book movies ever made. BVS, one of the best comic book movies ever made. Suicide Squad can't make those claims, but it's an okay movie. Wonder Woman, the first one of the best movies ever made, as far as I'm concerned, in the genre. The Snyder Cut, one of the best movies for sure ever made. Aquaman, one of the best movies of that type ever made. Groundbreaking. Shazam, a really good solid movie for kids. And James Gunn's The Suicide Squad is a really great live action attempt at bringing this Suicide Squad universe to life. There's a lot of good about the DCEU, but we need to clean things up. We need a Warner Discovery Studios, as I say every day, and I'm probably boring you. We need a DC Studios, but there's no point in just having a DC Studios. You need the right leaders. You need the right people in place. But the question I would ask you today, here on Wednesday's edition of the DCEU Daily, does David Zaslav just want to make a bunch of films that make money, or does he want to form the foundations of something utterly successful for the next 20 to 30 years? This has been the DCEU Daily here on Movies TV Mad with me, Mick, your host with the most. Just ask your girlfriends and your wives, like, share, comment, subscribe, hit the notification bell so you never miss this perfection. And I'll see you again tonight with the live show around 5, 6, maybe 7 o'clock, maybe even 8 o'clock tonight. Your guess is as good as mine for the Movies TV Mad Live. But I promise you, I will warn you on Twitter, at Movies TV Mad on Twitter. So come and follow me so you never miss a kick. I am retweeting and breaking all the entertainment news all day. I really love the entertainment industry. I love movies, TV dramas. So please stick with me, because if you are a geek and nerd, this really is the place to be. Until I see you on our live show tonight, and I hope you can join me. Goodbye. Au revoir. Auf Wiedersehen.